Okay, welcome all to the fourth Virtual Advances of Field Experiment Conference, seminar series, sorry. We are very happy to have Janet Currie give today's seminar. She's the Henry Putnam Professor of Economics and Public Affairs at Princeton University, and also the co-director of the Center for Health and Wellbeing at Princeton. And today she's gonna give her paper with Donna Ginther, Francine Blau, and Rachel Crowson on Can Mentoring Help Female Assistant Professors, an evaluation by a randomized trial. So for those that may be new to this seminar series, John and I will kind of like ask the questions that you ask in the Q&A. So please feel free to use the Q&A, vote on the questions so that we know what are all of the preferences that you have for the questions, and then we can give those questions to Janet. So I'd like to thank Janet for being here and welcome all again to those who are reoccurring visitors and those who are new. So thank you all, and turn it over to John.
Good day, everyone. I trust that all remain safe, healthy, and productive. Today, we're lucky to have Janet Currie. Janet graduated from Princeton in 1988 and soon became a key figure in the credibility revolution that took place in the 1990s. Her work in the areas of health, education, and broader social issues remain as important today as it was back then. Now, personally, I've been most moved by her work in education and health. When we started CHEC here at Chicago over a decade ago, Janet's work on early childhood interventions and intergenerational transmission of human capital affected our thinking deeply on how to design our own programs. When we then moved to health outcomes later in our project, her work on childhood nutrition and the ties between human capital and health again proved invaluable to our own research. Now, one aspect that a lot of you might not be aware is that Janet actually has deep roots in experimental economics. I vividly recall my very first meeting with Hugo Sonnenschein back in 2004. We were discussing bargaining experiments and the things that I was working on in the field. And I asked him point blank, whatever happened to that Janet Nealon, your co-author on the 1988 AER paper on testing Rubinstein's theory? She actually seemed to have a bright future, I said to Hugo. He chuckled and said, well, John, she has lived that bright future. She is now Janet Currie. So Janet, it has been a great pleasure learning from you all of these years. Everyone, without further delay, I give you the economist formerly named Janet Nealon.
Well, thank you very much, John and Robert, for inviting me and for that great introduction. A couple of comments. From what John was saying, you can see that this topic is not really my usual gig. I usually study things having to do with children rather than female assistant professors. And I ended up doing this with my co-authors on this paper, Donna Ginther, Fran Blau, and Rachel Crowson, mostly by virtue of being a relatively senior woman in the economics profession. And I also want to highlight and thank the NSF for initially supporting this work, and also the American Economics Association, which has been very supportive over quite a long time. And finally, you know, many women volunteered to be part of this. Many women still volunteer every year to be mentors and basically take 3 days of their time to participate in this activity. So thank you to everyone who started off. Also, as you'll see, this experiment started when we were a lot less sophisticated about experiments than we are today. So there were many bumps on the road, which I will try and talk about, because some of them maybe are interesting. Okay, so just a little bit of context. This figure is comparing two kind of notoriously sexist places in yellow here, Silicon Valley and also the Academy Awards nominating committee, where there's been a lot of fuss about the fact that women don't get nominated, to the economics profession, where you can see the fraction of economists who are in the tenure and tenure track, who are assistant professors or who are full professors. And of course, the point of the figure is those bars are pretty comparable. Okay, so economics is not looking so good on this particular metric. And there's a lot of research on this topic. So the previous literature suggests in particular that women are less likely to get tenure than men in economics. And there's been a lot of discussion about why that might be. Is it because women don't have the same networks? It does seem that they're less likely to co-author on average. So that's one thing that you can measure. Women may lack mentors. That's harder to measure. There's been some interesting work looking at tenure clock stopping policies. So in most places these days, if someone has a baby, they get an extra year on their tenure clock. Most places now have a gender neutral policy, so men also get an extra year on their tenure clock. And this paper suggested that that actually disadvantaged women relative to not having the policy at all. There's also been work looking at the peer review process, at the credit that women get for co-authored work, and also at sort of downright hostility towards women as documented in papers like Alice Wu's 2017 paper. So just to talk a little bit more about that, some of these things are, the reason why I'm bringing this up is that some of these things are things that you couldn't really hope to do anything about in a mentoring workshop. And to the extent that these kind of things are really the sole problem, then our mentoring program shouldn't have had much of an effect. Okay, so I thought this type of evaluation is interesting, looking at how candidates are evaluated. This one wasn't in economics, it was in science, where they were giving people hypothetical applications for lab manager with randomly assigned gender. So we've seen a lot of papers of this type in recent years. And applications that had a male name were rated as being more competent, more hireable, and they were also offered in this sort of hypothetical scenario at 15% higher starting salary. And interestingly, both male and female faculty members who were looking at these lab manager candidates were equally likely to exhibit this bias. Also, turning to the Sarson work, here, this is in economics. She was looking at CVs of economists up for tenure between 1975 and 2014 at top 30 institutions, and looks at the effect of an additional co-authored paper compared to a single authored paper on the probability of tenure for men versus women. And she has a lot of interesting cuts on this data. I'm just going to show you one, which is showing the just the relationship between number of publications and tenure. And so it turns out that men get more of a bang for number of publications than women, and this all turns out to be due to women getting downweighted when they co-author. Okay, so maybe there's a reason why women don't co-author as much as men. Maybe it's not in their interest to do so. Okay, so there's this kind of background. CSWEP itself has been documenting what they like to call the leaky pipeline for a long time. So in 2017, you had 32% of new PhDs in economics were female. 28% of assistant professors were female. 23% of tenured associate professors were female, and 13.9% of tenured full professors were female. So you know, these numbers by themselves in a cross-section don't prove anything. If the number of female graduates have been going up a lot over time, that would be reflected in numbers like this. But the thing is that since I graduated in 1988, those numbers have been essentially flat. So we've had, you know, about a third of the new PhDs being women for a long time now, and not any improvement in these other numbers. Okay, so that's the problem, that we have this leaky pipeline. The potential solution that we evaluated is the idea that a mentoring workshop could enhance untenured academic women's probability of getting tenure. So that was the whole point of the exercise. And the results that I'm going to show you indicate that this kind of mentoring actually can be helpful. Okay, so what did we do? Well, in 2004, we got some money to fund what was envisioned to be a biannual mentoring workshop, and we proposed to evaluate it using a randomized controlled trial. So that was kind of the new idea. There had been some mentoring workshops before, which people, you know, said favorable things about and said that they were helpful and people liked them, but there was no actual evidence that they worked. In 2007, after kind of 2 rounds of this, the AEA committed to funding the workshop after the NSF funding had run out. And then in 2010, we did an interim evaluation on the first 3 cohorts that had been through 2004, 2006, 2008. And that was too early to look at tenure, but we looked at whether the people who participated had more publications, whether they had more grants, and we found that there was some evidence that that was the case. This went on then for several more cohorts, biannually up to 2014, and each cohort being randomized. And then in 2015, the AEA decided, you know, before we'd actually done this evaluation, that it was a good program and they would commit to funding it on an annual basis from 2015, and the randomization was stopped. So we have these 6 cohorts that were randomized, and then now there's kind of a waiting list because there's still excess demand for this program, but they aren't explicitly randomized. So what is it? It's a workshop that's held in conjunction with the AEA annual meetings, and it's aimed at research faculty. So people who apply need to be in an institution where their research is going to matter for their tenure or promotion. And the reason why I'm being a little vague about that is because, for example, if your first job was at the Fed, arguably that could be a research institution. So they're mostly academic institutions, but they're not entirely. And we got about 80 applications or more for each wave. In order to improve sort of comparability of treatments and controls, we first sorted people into fields. So it would be like labor, macro, IO, experimental. There was actually always a fairly big experimental group involved with this, and probably Rachel Croson's influence. And so once they were sorted into groups, then we randomized them within groups into treatments and controls. So these were pretty small groups. There ended up being about 4 or 5 participants, and each group had it says 1 to 2 mentors, but usually we were shooting for 2, a more senior mentor and then a relatively junior mentor. So each participant had submitted a paper when they applied, and each paper was discussed in the small group. So everybody would read it in advance, the senior mentors discussed it, but also the peers in the group would discuss it. And each person got, you know, at least an hour of focused discussion on their work. Everybody was supposed to read all of the papers and provide comments on all of the papers. And then in between these small group discussions, there were discussions of the whole group with senior mentors talking about things like research and publication, how to get a grant, how to do networking when you go to conference, tips for teaching, lots of questions about how the tenure process works and things like that. So I actually participated in this year for the first time as a mentor, and it was very interesting to see how wide-ranging these discussions are and how many questions that people have. And sometimes the questions that people ask really make it quite clear that they don't have somebody to talk to or that they trust to talk to in their institution, right? Because otherwise they wouldn't be asking those questions in this context. Okay, so the participant reaction for the first several waves, we had a exit survey, and so we asked people what they thought about various things, and the reaction was pretty positive. So the types of comments we got were like this: although I've been teaching for more than 5 years, I still found many of the discussions and much of the advice extremely helpful. Some of the comments also suggest long-lasting effects. So I think one of the more mysterious aspects of this is it's only a 2-day thing. It is pretty intensive. So it's like, 8 to 5 every day and then dinner. But still, it's a relatively short, low-touch intervention. But it seems to have had these long-lasting effects. And one reason for that seems to be that at least some of the groups kept in touch regularly afterwards. So for example, my group has already been in touch and plan to meet like every 6 months and see how people are doing. People send copies of papers that have been revised and so on. I like this second quote here. The person says, "The workshop had a huge impact on my career. I was at an economics department with very few women. At the ASSA meetings 2 years later, the whole team sat down for 2 hours to go through my NSF proposal paragraph by paragraph. It greatly improved the quality of the proposal. This workshop was the best thing that happened to me since my marriage." So that was nice. Okay, so it's great that people liked it. We knew that people liked the earlier iterations of this already. And so that's still not evidence that it actually worked, that you have some anecdotes that people found it helpful. So the question was how to collect follow-up data on these treatments and controls. And this is where we hit some of the bumps in the road. First of all, our first idea was that we were going to survey everybody, and that didn't work. For one thing, controls often were kind of bitter about having been randomized out of this intervention. So here's this intervention. It's supposed to help people get tenure. You're telling people you can't do it, and they were not happy about that. So the surveys didn't work very well. What we realized eventually, though, was that you could find all of these people on the internet. You could find out various pieces of information about them, and that actually might be a more reliable way to collect information. The other issue, I should say, is that when we were still doing the survey thing, we would send a survey. We would also ask people to send a recent copy of their CV. And it was very hard to collect information from people's CVs, actually, surprisingly difficult, because you would have a lot of publications that were forthcoming. You'd have publications that changed their name from when they were forthcoming to when they were not forthcoming anymore. You had all kinds of things listed as grants, which may or may not have been actual grants, bits of funding from their department or whatever. So what we ended up doing was focusing on publications from Web of Science. So that was an externally verifiable thing. That has some cost, because then we wouldn't know if somebody had, say, a forthcoming JPE paper at the time that they came up for tenure, but it was one way to treat everybody the same. And similarly, we ended up focusing on federal grants. So if you have an NSF grant or an NIH grant, all of that is public information. So you can search a database and find that information. The piece of information that turned out to be most difficult to track down was actually, in some sense, the most important, which is whether people had tenure or not. A difficulty is that there are a lot of institutions that still have associate professors. Sometimes associate professors are associates with tenure, and sometimes they do not have tenure. That was one problem. There's also a lot of people who ended up in foreign institutions, which may have systems that are not very similar to the US tenure track. So what we ended up doing was, again, searching. Oftentimes, for example, universities will have a little article that talks about people who got tenure in their institution, and so you can find out information that way. For people who we couldn't find out information, we contacted them, and everyone we contacted eventually replied about whether they had tenure or not, or if it was sort of a complicated case, they would explain it, and then we would try and make a judgment about whether that represented a tenured job or not.
Janet?
Yes.
This is super so far. Do you mind taking a few questions? We're getting a lot of action on the Q&As.
Sure.
Maybe now's a good time to pause. I want to start off by asking, and this is coming from Teresa. She asks, I wonder if getting into the program also affected the decision to attend the AEA meetings themselves, in which case part of the effect that you're picking up could possibly include that of networking and visibility at the actual meetings that were beyond the mentoring that you're trying to identify.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. I mean, some of the advice that people were getting as well would reinforce that, so there were sessions on networking, which would be, like you telling people, yes, you should go to these meetings. Yes, when you're at these meetings, talk to people. Strategies for how do you go up to senior people that you haven't met before and have a interview of some sort with them if you think that's important for your career. Like, how do you do that? So there was a lot of emphasis on that, and I think that's definitely a potential issue.
Now, so thanks, Janet. Also, Carrie Deck asks about the actual mentorship program itself. When you have subfields, did the program actually put people into subfields? So all of the folks who were in experimental economics, for example, would be in the same group, or did they mix the subfields?
No, it was by subfield, because it's a little bit ancient history now to think about what we were thinking back in the 2002, 2003 when we were starting this. But I think one of the ideas was that if you have somebody who they may lack support in various ways, so they may not have any women, they may not have other people in their field either to talk to about, and they may not have a senior woman in their field, right? So by putting people in groups with other people from their field, both senior people and peers, you're hoping to provide some potential to mitigate that.
Further question, Janet. by Shanti Manian, which is, she participated in the cement program, and she got feedback about how to write up the CVs. So is there a concern about sort of differential reporting of the research output, both grants and publications and working papers amongst the treatment group professors versus the control group, because they kept their CVs up to date? So it's kind of like, it's affecting the reporting decision and the timing of the reporting decision.
Yeah, so I just want to clarify, we didn't end up using very much information from CVs because they're not standard at all. And it's totally possible that the treatment CVs are on average better in some sense than the controls. So the data that I'm going to show you is all from publicly verifiable sources and not CVs. The only piece of information that we used CVs for, but we also verified, was whether or not people had tenure.
Got it. Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, so now I'm going to go on to talking a little bit more about the data. So one controversial issue in economics has to do with rankings. So we all care a lot about rankings, but nobody agrees on how things should be ranked. So we picked, relatively prominent ranking from 2003 and used the same one throughout. We ranked both departments. So that would include the department that you graduated from, the department where you got your first job, the department where you are now, and also publications. And so somewhat arbitrarily, we used as top ranked journals the AER, JPE, QJE, Econometrica, and Restat. So we had like a top 5. We controlled for the cohort that you were in from 2004 to 2014. And we selected only people who had more than 6 years since their PhD, so that there was some possibility that they could have tenure. And that left us with 368 observations. Okay, so this table is delving into a little bit more about the structure of the data, and will basically reveal another big problem that we had, besides people not responding or having not similar information in CVs. And that was that a lot of the people who were initially assigned to be controls didn't like that very much and reapplied. So early on, we had this problem, which is, should we say that if you ever applied and weren't selected, that you could never participate in this program? And we judged, rightly or wrongly, that no, we couldn't do that in something that was being funded by the AEA. We couldn't just say to some people that they were permanently out of luck. So what you'll see in this table, if you count over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the 5th column is showing controls who reapplied. So the first number before the semicolon shows in the first row, for example, that 5 people who were initially assigned to be controls reapplied. And then of those 5, 2 of them were eventually treated. Okay, so this means that if you were initially assigned to control but were persistent, you could influence your probability of being treated, right? Which is a threat to the whole design of the thing. So what we end up doing in the results that I'm going to show you is, you can also see that the number of people treated sort of goes up, and that's because if you were in the last cohort, 2014, after that in 2015, they went annual and stopped randomizing, so your probability of getting in if you reapplied was much higher by the end of the period. So what we do is adopt an intent to treat approach, where we use your initial assignment to treatment or control, the first time that you ever applied, as an instrument for whether or not you were treated. Okay. You can also see, if you look at the last column, that we couldn't follow absolutely everybody. And so there, what we end up doing is assuming that if you had a tenured job, or like a tenured job at a top 30 place, that we would be able to find you. And so if we can't find you, then you probably don't have one of those jobs. Okay, so we're not going to lose them, but we're going to assume that they don't have a tenure track job. Okay, so there are some mean differences between the treatments and controls. They're not statistically significantly different. I guess we have relatively small samples here, so that might be one reason. But you can see that we had people, more people from top 10 institutions, more people from top 20 institutions were applying to begin with. Most of the people had US PhDs. Most of them had first jobs that were academic first jobs. Again, we have more people with first jobs from the top 10, and then 11 to 20, and then 21 to 40. Okay, so this program was slightly more appealing, it seems, given that we were randomly selecting people from the top institutions. Okay, so I mentioned that people who reapplied could increase the probability of being treated. So the actual treatment then is no longer randomly selected, and we use this intent to treat approach. The controls include the person's initial cohort, the years since PhD, both as separate dummies, and our first stage works very well, at least in terms of the F statistic. So your initial assignment is very predictive of whether you ever got treated. Okay. And so this table is showing essentially our main results broken out in different ways. So what we call tenure stream, it just means that you're in a tenure track job. So you may or may not have tenure, but you're in a tenure track job. And we see an increase, which you can compare to the mean of the dependent variable that's at the bottom there. So that's a relatively large increase in being in a tenure stream job. If we look at whether you're in a tenure stream job in a top 100 institution, that is a much larger effect. So then it's a little surprising that if you look at column 3, there isn't actually a significant effect on whether you actually have tenure. Not overall, but again, if we break it out, there seems to be a positive effect on having a tenured job in a top 30 institution, a tenured job in a top 50 institution. The top 100 is positive, but not statistically significant. And then there's a negative effect of being in the top 200 plus, okay? And a negative effect on the probability of being in a non-academic job. Okay, so what's going on here? Is this harming people in lower ranked institutions? We don't think so. We think one of the things that's happening here is that people are choosing different career tracks. And so one possible career track is that if you're in a tenure track job and you're not going to get tenure at your current institution, an option is to take like a second term assistant professor job, which would mean that you were still in a tenure track job, but that you had not yet gotten tenure. Right? So to the extent that you move up the system by taking jobs which are untenured but involve a somewhat longer tenure clock, that could be consistent with these results.
Janet, hi. So that's really interesting. I was wondering if you had an outcome variable such as the one that you just defined. And what I'm thinking is, over time, you moved to an academic institution that is more highly ranked than the one that you were at when you did the workshop?
Yeah, so I think one of the things about this project is it's kind of like every 5 or 6 years we can check in again and see what happened. So if that's what's going on, then in 5 or 6 years we should see a bigger bump in tenure, because the people who took that gamble would be past that hurdle. Yeah, so we haven't done that for this because we thought we'd be hitting a lot of people sort of like halfway through at that point. If I go 5 years in one place and then I go somewhere else, even if I came up a little early in that place, then I'm still going to be looking at 10 or 11 years instead of 7. But yeah, I expect I'm going to be doing this project until I retire. Okay, so another issue is that in the 6th cohort, there were a lot of people who had their PhDs post 2011 who were dropping. And so we also re-estimate everything with just the first 5 cohorts to make sure that that's not causing any problem. The results of doing that are very similar. So apparently it wasn't causing a problem. And then we spent a little bit of time looking at possible mechanisms in terms of grants and publications, although not, as John was suggesting, mobility, which I think would be a really interesting thing to look at. We do see some positive effects on publications. So the people who participated tend to, on average, have 1.5 more publications. They also have more top publications, so 0.2 higher top 5 publications, a little bit more rank 2 publications, so those are like the top field journals or AEJ Applied, things like that. And then there's a positive coefficient on rank 3 publications, but not statistically significant. So this is actually kind of comforting, because to the extent that people were getting individualized attention, it was individualized attention on their paper. And, how can you take this paper and make it better? And so it seems like people were able to use that advice to get a better paper. A question is, does that explain most of the result that we see on tenure, especially in top places? And so here I'm showing you what happens to the probability of getting tenure in a top 30 place if you control for the number of publications. And you can see that that basically eliminates the tenure effect. So this seems like an important mechanism. If we look at the probability of getting tenure in a top 50 place, there's still a somewhat positive effect, not statistically significant. Maybe there's some additional effect beyond the effect on publications, but we're not showing it here. Okay, again, we can do the same thing for the cohorts 1 to 5. Similar pattern of results. Now this last result becomes sort of marginally significant. Okay. So just to summarize the results, the treated women are more likely to be in tenure stream jobs. They're less likely to be in non-academic jobs. The treated women are more likely to be tenured in top 50 departments and less likely to be tenured in unranked departments. That's what 200 plus means. And a lot of the effect seems to be operating through a higher number of pre-tenure publications, although the sort of less tangible impacts like having a support network could also be important and could be, it may not all be the great comments that we made during the meeting. It could be that having a support network also facilitates publication. So I just wanted to come back to the issue I raised at the beginning in a little bit of a postscript, thinking about all these other sources of gender disparities. How likely is it that by changing their own behavior, women can have a major impact on gender disparities? Because essentially that's what a mentoring workshop is doing. It's sort of trying to teach people how they can impact their own tenure probabilities. So I'm going to talk now with the moderator's license about somebody else's experiment that just shows that women do have some agency when it comes to how their careers are going to go. So this is an experiment by Vesterland, Babcock, Ricald, and Weingart, which is looking at how likely women are to get stuck with what they call non-promotable tasks. And the gist of this is going to be that women are more often asked to do non-promotable tasks. And one reason why they're more likely to be asked is probably because they're more likely to accept. Okay, so they demonstrate this with some lab experiments where members of groups are given 2 minutes to make an investment. And if no one cooperates, then people get $1. But if one person decides to be cooperative and make the investment, then that person gets $1.25 and the other people get $2. So they do this experiment in a mixed group and then in a same-sex group, and the results are shown here. So the probability of investing in a mixed sex group is much higher for the women than for the men. But if it's a same-sex group, the probability is the same. Okay? So what they're arguing essentially is that everybody believes that women are more likely to be cooperative. Even the women believe that. And so when they're in this situation where somebody has to step up, the women sort of look around and say, well, the guys aren't going to do this, so I will volunteer. Right? In a same-sex group, they don't do that. They have a third experiment, so they have a number of different twists on this, but in this third experiment, you have a fourth person who's a requester. And so they need to ask one of the 3 other members of the group to do the investment. And the requester has an incentive for somebody to do this. And what they show is that the requester is more likely to pick a woman, and that the women respond more favorably than men to these direct requests. Okay, so this is an example basically of something that women can do something about. Bringing it back to the mentoring, it's something that people are explicitly warned about. We talked about the just say no to excessive requests for service and how to say no. You know, like don't just say flat out no, tell them about the 5 other committees that you're already on, things like that. Okay. So to conclude then, this workshop addressed some very specific issues, the need to have peers and mentors to discuss research products with in order to improve them, the need for advice from experienced mentors about many different kinds of career issues. I think, as I said, it's remarkable that a 2-day intervention could have a quite large effect, but these workshops were designed to create an ongoing relationship with other people in the same field. And indeed, we know of many examples of women who kept in touch with contacts for years afterwards and used those networks for advice and support. So I think these results speak to the importance of having mentors and peer networks, and in that sense suggest the difficulties that many women in economics still face in developing these relationships. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take more questions.
Fantastic, thanks, Janet. Yeah, I think there's a lot of questions on the Q&A. A lot about mechanisms. So Nicholas's question is, obviously the mentors were successful economists in their own right. So is there a chance that the mechanism might be that they have a closer relationship with senior editors of the top 5 journals, and it's those papers get solicited? So was there analysis done on those papers that were put forward for the comments to the successful mentors? And is that a possible mechanism?
So that's a really good question. I think that we didn't collect the data on all of the papers. Like, we don't have all the papers in an archive somewhere, which was probably a significant oversight. It is true that, you know, part of the intention was to put people in touch with a senior mentor. And a lot of the discussion that I had with my group, for example, was, well, where do you think I should send this paper, right? And it's like teaching people how to think about that problem. It's like, oh, well, you're thinking of sending it to such and such journal. Who are the editors of that journal? You know, do you think any of them would like your paper? Just stuff like that, you know. So there's a lot of explicit discussion, and that could certainly be a mechanism.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, along those lines, Janet, sounds very nice, thank you. Sven Gruner asks, is there something like a Hawthorne effect due to mentoring? And what he's thinking about are the old Hawthorne experiments from the 20s over here in Cicero, Illinois, where he says there's more attention, and because of that attention, there'll be more motivation. So under his potential question, it's more than something like what you've been given in terms of connections or insights. It's about you're given attention, so you want to achieve because of that attention.
Okay, so I can see I'm going to have a problem here in that there may be no mechanisms that are suggested where I will say, no, that's not a possible mechanism. But to speak to this point, I mean, you think a little, why do peers matter, right? Why does it matter if there's other people that you can talk to about your work? It may not be entirely that the other people are going to give you great ideas. Maybe it's just that they think that your work, that it's interesting, or that it's a good question, or they're sympathetic that you're frustrated because you can't solve some problem, right? It's, I guess I would frame it not so much as attention as support. You know, like attention is a form of support for people. So yeah, I think that's totally a possible mechanism. But you have to think a little bit about, well, what do you expect to get from peers? Attention is certainly one of them. If you email your peers and none of them ever email back, then you wouldn't feel that they were a very good peer group.
Yeah, so I agree with your response, actually. So Rob, let me take another one, then you can go. So this is from Yan Chen. And Yan was one of the first cohort of mentees in COFFE, and later one of the mentors in Cement. And I think, Yan, I came in and talked to the Cement group in San Diego, as I recall. So she said her group continued to have monthly email updates until everyone was tenured. And she knows anecdotally, at least, that there was a lot of heterogeneity in whether the groups kept up or not. She's wondering if you have enough data to look for heterogeneous treatment effects and look at short run versus long run groups and how that affected outcomes, because that might give you some more insights about the underlying mechanisms at work.
Yes, I actually think that's completely true. And even anecdotally from the beginning, there were always, you know, there were always reports about groups that didn't work for one reason or another, right? Or that didn't keep up, or so I'm sure that there's heterogeneity. I don't think, if you look at our standard errors, that we have power to cut the sample up very much, which is unfortunate and sort of it's a little bit of a cautionary tale itself in terms of just running experiments, right? Here we are, we have an experiment running. There's a relatively small group that can be targeted. There is a relatively small group that can be served given the financial resources that we had. And so, it is what it is. And so at the end of the day, after running this for a long time, we end up with 328 observations, right? So that is very limiting. And I think it's also worth thinking about in terms of, there is a parallel committee to CSWAP that is charged with thinking about the position of minorities in economics, which is actually way worse in terms of representation than the position of women in economics. And there are various activities that the AEA does to try and promote minorities, and none of those have been evaluated in this way, but there's a question of whether they could be evaluated in this way given the very small numbers. So.
All right. Great. So there's a few questions about scaling and generalizability in the Q&A. So one of them from Angelino is that given the focus in this program so far has been on research institutions, how might this program fare if it was scaled to more of the hybrid or teaching institutions where the focus is on like the innovation and the research of the teaching itself, not just top 5 publications? And how do we think about how the mentees would be drawn from a certain distribution if the program was scaled to those type of hybrid institutions?
Yes, so there is a program that's been running over the same time interval for people in teaching institutions, which takes place not at the AEA, but in conjunction with the regional economic meetings. So like the Easterns, the Southerners, the Westerns. I don't know if there's a Midwest one. And I think that has served a lot of people. It was never randomized. So I think part of it is that going back to 2002 when we were thinking about this, it was kind of controversial to randomize. And so the people who are running the research one, who are researchers, felt really strongly that it should be randomized. And there were other people who didn't feel so strongly about that, and also it felt that it was already a proven concept. And so that's sort of how it ended up. So I guess it's a bit of a missed opportunity in terms of seeing how well this kind of a format works for mentoring people in teaching institutions. But that's how it is.
Got it.
So Janet, there was a paper published a long time ago. I can remember when I was just about to go to graduate school, Becky Blank wrote a paper on single blind versus double blind reviewing, and she did an experiment with the AER. I think it was published in 1991 AER. And I can't recall the exact results, but I thought that she found that there was not a large effect on women, but there was an effect on the rank of the school that the person was sending their paper in from. And I found that interesting because I started my career at the University of Central. So if you would do that kind of study today, I don't know if you remember that study, my bet is you do, but if you would do that kind of study today, what sorts of results do you think we would find if we would do sort of an analysis at that level, like Becky did back then in the late 80s, early 90s?
So actually I'm trying to remember the authors, so I'm sorry I don't remember the name right now. But there is another paper that's more recent that looks at the issue of whether, say, male referees favor males compared to female referees favoring females, which is one of the questions that Becky looked at and found no evidence that that was the case. And so I think a lot of the a lot of the evidence that's coming out is that there are biases, but women have those biases just as much as men. So it's very internalized. Like the study that I talked about that was looking at lab managers and rating a male name or a female name on an application. So that's something for people to keep in mind, is that just because you're female, or I suppose just because you're a minority, doesn't mean that you're not capable of discriminating against people like yourself.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Where I was kind of going is that if you think about schools as like SES categories, I think Becky would say that there was discrimination across SES categories. And we don't hear a lot of discussion about that, at least in academic work, about we have SES discrimination that you and I both talk about in early childhood, in human capital, and in placement, but we don't see as much of that in the academy. And I'm wondering if you would, that was kind of an interesting result that Becky found on, it really mattered a lot if you came from a mid-tier versus a high-ranking school in terms of single versus double-blind evaluation mattered a lot for you in that case. I wonder if that is still alive and well in terms of discrimination across SES categories, so to speak. And I'm using that loosely, of course, you understand.
Yeah, I think it probably is. I mean, a lot of organizations that I've been involved with are quite concerned about that. And so there's always this tension in the sense of, you know, you want to put together a committee, you want to have, quote unquote, the best people on the committee, but you also want to have representation. So, yeah, I think if you looked at that, it would be alive and well, as you put it.
So another question about sort of scalability from Alexander is, were you able to check whether the treated females, sort of how they compared with the sort of matched men in their cohort, to see whether the effects that you find, is that coming at the expense of other females who are in the control group, or are they actually just getting better over their cohort of men at the same time? So if we think about scaling this out, how do we think the sort of direction of the effects will go?
Oh, that's an interesting point of view. So I guess they're thinking that places might have a quota on women. So for example, if I hire this woman, then I'm not going to hire this other woman, but I still have my woman spot. And that could be the case. I think the discussion about mechanisms, limited as it is, showing that people are actually publishing more and publishing better, suggests to me that it's not sort of an entirely zero-sum thing. But we haven't done a sort of matched comparison with men from the same institutions. That would be possible. It would be a big job. It's actually not so easy to recover data about past classes of PhD students, for those of you who have tried to do that. But it could be done.
Got it. And then just one last question from Danny Tannenbaum is, did you look at whether the female assistant professors in the treatment group were more likely to write and co-author with the mentees, the mentors, especially if they were in senior positions, for example, at editorial board of a top 5 journal?
No, we haven't looked at that. Donna Ginther is actually doing some more work looking at the specifically at networks of co-authors and how that was affected, and whether people are co-authoring more with people who are in their groups, not only senior people, but also lateral level. Because co-authorship is definitely a way to increase productivity in our profession. And so being introduced to a pool of potential co-authors could be productive in itself.
Absolutely. Thank you, Janet.
Now, so really the last question, Janet, and this has come up in a few places, but I'm going to read it from David Novgorodsky. And this is about the size of your estimates. So when you were going through them, he asks, is this really an IV estimate of 9 pp, which in that case would have been a 75% increase on a mean of 0.125? And kind of in general, you saw some large estimates there in various places in your results. So you can comment on the magnitude of the estimates that you're reporting?
Yeah, some of them are quite large. The standard errors are also large. So some of it, that's one reason why we did a lot of different cuts on the data, right? Is to try and see whether this was coming from, one particular influential point or something like that. So I would say I have confidence that there's a positive effect. Do I have confidence that it's actually a 75% effect? Not so much, right? And I think this type of work obviously needs to be replicated, maybe in some other settings. I know there's some European groups that are doing something similar. So hopefully we'll have information not just from this study, but from other studies that will be helpful.
I agree. Thanks, Janet. And we're going to have to close this down. I want to thank all of the participants again for all. This is amazing, Janet. We'll send you all these questions that have come in, so it will help you revise your study, which is wonderful. And I just want to say, Janet, thanks from Robert, myself, and the rest of the economics community for taking on this very important issue. I mean, you have a history of taking on just wonderful issues: health, education, labor more broadly, early education, and now gender issues, which we clearly have in our profession. So I want to say thanks a lot, and thanks for coming to our seminar series.
Okay, thanks for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, Janet. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for taking part in the Q&A. It was really, really great and really helpful for us to ask questions to Janet. And we look forward to seeing you all next week, where Leo Burstein is presenting Misperceived Social Norms, Women Working Outside the Home in Saudi Arabia. So looking forward to seeing you all then. So thank you all.
Thanks, Janet.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.